The great English historian Edward Gibbon opened his vast panorama of the history on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire with the following words. In the 2nd century of the Christian era, the Empire of Rome comprehended the fairest part of the earth and the most civilized portion of mankind. The frontiers of that extensive monarchy were guarded by ancient renown and disciplined valor. The gentle but powerful influence of laws and manners had gradually cemented the union of the provinces. Their peaceful inhabitants enjoyed and abused the advantages of wealth and luxury. The image of a free constitution was preserved with decent reverence. The Roman Senate appeared to possess the sovereign authority and devolved on the emperors all the executive powers of government. If a man were called upon to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. That is, of course, the years that he's referring to there are from 96 AD until 180 AD. That is a very powerful statement, and it may be quite interesting for any of us, I suppose, to think, what would we fix as the period when the condition of the human race was the happiest? But be that as it may, most scholars would agree that the good times persisted not only until 180, but really until the death of Alexander Severus, who died in 235 AD. Thereafter, though, the Roman world plunged into a deep, deep crisis. Before we get there, though, during the Severan Dynasty, that is, during the dynasty that took over after the death of Marcus Aurelius' son Commodus, we have contrary information regarding persecution. So, for instance, we read in a rather enigmatic work that dates from slightly after this period, but is about this period, the historian, the Augustan history, as it's called in English, the Scriptores Historiae Augustae, that in 202 AD, Septimius Severus promoted his eldest son and appointed him consul as a colleague to himself. And without further delay, while still in Syria, the two entered upon their consulship. After this, having first raised his soldiers' pay, he turned his steps toward Alexandria, and while on his way thither, he conferred numerous rights upon communities of Palestine. He forbade conversion to Judaism under heavy penalties and enacted a similar law in regard to the Christians. He then gave the Alexandrians the privilege of a local senate, for they were still without any public council. So there's some kind of forceful threat against the Christian community, forbidding the conversion to Christianity. But then on the other hand, we find statements such as this. Even Severus himself, the father of Antoninus, that is the emperor that goes by the name Caracalla in popular histories, was graciously mindful of the Christians, for he sought out the Christian Proclus, surnamed Terpacion, the business agent of Euodius, and in gratitude for his having once cured him by anointing, he kept him in his palace till the day of his death. Antoninus Caracalla, too, brought up as he was on Christian milk, was intimately acquainted with this man. Both women and men of the highest rank, whom Severus knew well to be Christians, were not merely permitted by him to remain uninjured, but he even bore distinguished testimony in their favor and gave them publicly back to us in the hands of a raging populace. Tertullian mentions all of this. So obviously during some of the emperors of the Severan Dynasty, which basically lasts from the 190s until 235, we have every reason to believe that persecutions continued under the Severans as they had before, being, as I said before, those three kind of key words to describe them, being localized, brief, and sporadic. Often, no doubt, without even the knowledge of the emperor. So even if there was an emperor, as Caracalla seems to be described as being, he's part of the Severan dynasty, even though he might have been personally kind of sympathetic to Christianity, nevertheless, most of these persecutions took place on the local level, enacted by local officials and or by local mobs. A major development, however, took place under the reign of the Emperor Antoninus, again colloquially known as Caracalla, in the year 212 AD. And this was the so-called Constitutio Antoniniana, a decree that all freeborn people living in the empire were now citizens. We only have the smallest little fragmentary version of the actual text of this decree. And we could just read it right now. The Emperor Caesar Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus Augustus Caracalla declares, and then it breaks off, I may show my gratitude to the immortal gods for preserving me in such, and then it breaks off again. Therefore, I consider that in this way I can, breaks off again, render proper service to their majesty by bringing with me to the worship of the gods all who enter into the number of my people. Look at it, it has a very, even though it's giving citizenship to every freeborn person living inside the boundaries of the empire, it has a distinctly religious character to this decree. Accordingly, I grant Roman citizenship to all aliens throughout the world, with no one remaining outside the citizen bodies except the dedicticii, for it is proper that the multitude should not only help carry all the burdens, but should also now be included in my victory. This edict, blah, 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 we don't know, the majesty of the Roman people. There has been a whole flurry of scholarship devoted to issues surrounding this document, especially in somewhat recent years, prompted by its 1900-year anniversary 9 years ago. And if you want to read more about all of that, this would be the work I would direct you to. This is the most recent one that just was published in the past year. But nevertheless, the effect of the Constitutio Antoniniana, the effect of granting everybody living within the empire to become full Roman citizens, the effect of this vis-a-vis Christianity is summed up well by the scholar Novak, who says the following words. Regardless of the motive for Caracalla's grant of citizenship, you know, the fact that he said he wanted to bring everybody to the worship of the gods, okay, and so that is one of the few things that it comes across loud and clear inside the text. One effect of the grant was to make it more difficult for Christians to avoid those civic obligations of citizenship that were related to the worship and honor of the pagan gods and the emperor. Much of public office revolved around the financing, organizing, and holding of various public religious festivals. We've talked about this a lot. And most urban social life centered on these festivals. The Christian refusal to participate in these events only accentuated the distinctive differences between Christians and their neighbors at a time when Christianity was still seeking wider acceptance. At the same time, many, but not all, Christians sought to avoid military duty because it was deeply intertwined with pagan religious worship, pagan symbols, and the emperor's cult. But of course, there were Christian soldiers too. There's many early martyrs who were soldiers in the Roman army who refused to worship the gods and the emperor and were ultimately martyred for it. As in the days of Marcus Aurelius, remaining separate from the social life of the larger community and avoiding governmental and military service in an age of increasing threat to the Roman Empire could only have served to make Christians unpopular among the more conservative elements of both the imperial administration and the general population. So a very nice distillation of the issue at hand here. By the way, in case you're wondering who the dedicticii, we're not really sure who those people are. The word seems to imply to people who had been captured in war, so like prisoners of war or something like that. Whatever the case may be on that. After the death of Caracalla, and after some jockeying for power by certain military figures outside the imperial household, the youthful Alexander Severus, the last of the Severan Dynasty, assumed the throne. He was ultimately assassinated, though, in the year 235, bringing an end to the Severan Dynasty. And in the wake of this collapse in that year, the entire system of imperial management imploded, with the situation deteriorating hideously for the next 5 decades. Now, to put this implosion of the system of imperial management into perspective, In the roughly 265 years between the rise of the first emperor Augustus in 27 BC to the death of Alexander Severus in 235 AD, there were only 24 legitimate emperors during that time. There were 15 claimants, that would be people who tried to become emperor, usurpers, but still only 24 legitimate emperors in that 265-year period. In the 50-year period from the death of Alexander Severus in 235 to the accession of Diocletian, the emperor, in 284, there were 21 legitimate emperors and no less than 38 claimants, 38 people scrambling, trying to usurp the throne. And in addition to that, there were 11 rulers of two secessionist Roman states, two breakaway states from the Roman Empire. These figures alone tell you that the collapse of army loyalty had an appalling political series of consequences. Now, we do not need to trace the lives of all the 60 or so individuals who held power or aspired to it in these 50 years. But I will first briefly outline the problems that generated this instability, and then look at 4 of the legitimate emperors as sort of exemplars for how these problems played out in real terms. And then we shall also examine several claimants and secessionists to illustrate how rivals to the legitimate emperors fared in these difficult years. This period of time, that is known by modern historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, this crisis was generated by 2 interlocking factors. The first was a dire change in the nature of the threats that Rome faced outside of the empire. And then the second was a collapse of internal political stability. Those are the 2 major interlocking factors. The latter, the collapse of internal political stability, had occurred before in Roman history. There had been moments, there had been intervals of instability in the Roman Empire before, but they had been brief. For instance, between the year 68 and 69, in a period of time of a little over 18 months, this was the year of the so-called 4 emperors, the year of the 4 emperors, after the death of Nero. Nero had taken pains to make sure there was no person in his family alive who could possibly lay claim to the throne. He had them all killed off, assassinated. And so once he died, there was nobody else to take over the throne. So there was a big kind of like royal rumble among many different Roman generals, all trying to lay claim to the throne. And that lasted ultimately about 18 months. Likewise, there had been a 4-year period of sporadic civil war from 193 to 197, ultimately leading to the accession of the Severan Dynasty, Septimius Severus. So again, after a major dynasty dies and there's nobody to take over, then you would have these rather brief periods of political instability before. But these prior periods of instability were not attended by the dreadful external security situation facing the men who ruled in the wake of the Severan Dynasty. Before the 3rd century AD, Rome had faced either external invasions or internal political instability, but the 2 had never really coincided. But now, during the 3rd century, external invasion and the internal political stability that I've been describing hit at the same time, and they were compounded by a 3rd factor, namely an economic meltdown, specifically hyperinflation, something that we can maybe relate to a little bit right now, and which, it has been argued, caused the Roman economy to come close to collapse, as we will examine. Specifically, along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, some perhaps 2,000 miles in total, enormous coalitions of Germanic tribes had formed, replacing the fairly small individual tribes of early generations. This process had already begun in the 2nd century, but by the 3rd century, the coalitions were well established and ready to act. Worse, they were joined by newcomers from the northeast, peoples like the Goths or the Franks. Okay, now these are Germanic tribes. I know, see, when I was your age and somebody mentioned the word Goths, I would get an image of somebody dressed like Marilyn Manson. But that's not who we're talking about here. The Goths were a Germanic people originating apparently in Sweden, actually. That there is a place called Göteborg, and in Old English, Sweden was often called Geatland. So it seems that that word, that Goth and of Sweden, is what we call Goths. So they originated in Sweden, but then had wended their way down over the centuries to Ukraine, and then over now into the Rhine and Danube frontiers. And the Franks are another Germanic people. Don't be confused by the fact that they gave their name to the country of France. They were originally Germanic tribes. Anyway, so these are obviously, though, these are new people on the scene, and we're basically entering into the period of late Roman history that is going to segue into the early medieval period. So obviously, these tribes are going to be players in the early medieval period. The point to make in all of this, though, is that the pressure on the frontier was immense, as the military capability of the tribes far outstripped anything but the limited imperial forces facing them along the frontiers had ever encountered before. That was bad enough, but in the East, a new threat also emerged at this very same time, because the tottering Parthian state finally fell in the 220s to one of her vassals, Persia. Led by energetic kings of the Sassanid dynasty, the new Persian state laid claim to the lands of the Eastern Empire. So this is all of these, if you're going to want to look on the screen over here, it's all of this area over here would be part of the Sassanid Persian dynasty. And therefore, confronted by these multiple and simultaneous external threats, emperors were simply overwhelmed. And in being so, they were politically weakened. Since for a long time, emphasis had always been placed on military leadership and achievement as a cardinal virtue of the princeps of the emperor, an emphasis only strengthened during the Severan Dynasty. Emperors who were defeated or else were ineffective in the field could only appear politically vulnerable. For instance, Alexander Severus, the young man who we just were talking about, the last of the Severan dynasties, he was murdered by his own troops who had been incensed because he had bought off German tribesmen, basically. He, instead of winning a victory over them, he had basically bribed them to stop raiding. And so we're going to take a look at several different examples of this sort of thing, but that's kind of what we're facing here now. Emperors are now living in fear of being assassinated by their own troops. And then, as rivals rose up and added to the incumbents' headaches, instability was compounded, right? If you have to fear all the time when you have different generals all vying for your throne, that's only going to bring, that means one more thing you have to worry about. You can't really deal with the external threats. All of these factors combined then led to a reproduction of the late Republican multipolar political universe in Rome, where it was somewhat unclear who was in charge, or even really who ought to be in charge. And this altogether only emboldened external enemies all the more, because they now saw their chance to strike while rival emperors were clawing at each other's throats inside of the empire. The whole system, therefore, can be seen as a sort of positive feedback loop, whereby external threats generated internal uncertainty, which then in turn intensified the external threats, which then in turn only deepened the internal uncertainty. You see, it's like one big circle. And this, in essence, is the nature of the 3rd century crisis. Internal and external factors combining and feeding off each other to maximize the chaos. These were dark days to live in indeed, never mind to preside over. 4 men can act as illustrations of how the legitimate emperors fared in these hard years. And they are Maximinus Thrax, wonderful name, the immediate successor to the Severan dynasty, Trajan Decius in the middle of the 3rd century, and the father-son combination of Valerian and Gallienus, who attempted to establish a dynasty in the midst of all this mayhem. Now, one word before we go into the kind of description of these 4 rulers. We should note briefly before proceeding the extremely poor state of our source material for the lives of these men. Essentially, aside from coins, occasional inscriptions, and the brief sketchy history of the Byzantine scholar Zosimus, we are confined to the confabulations of the Augustan history, that work I already quoted for you before, a very strange document filled with all sorts of accounts that are sometimes challenged by modern scholars, that are sometimes even contradictory, as we saw. And then, of course, there are the accounts of the later Roman historian Cassius Dio and also Herodian. But these run out, though, in the year 229 for Dio and 238 for Herodian. So we have this period is not as well documented as other parts of Roman history. Okay, with that in mind, though, let's begin. Maximinus Thrax was a common soldier who had risen up through the ranks. He hailed from Thrace, and that's why he got his nickname Thrax. It simply means the Thracian. And this made him, though, in the eyes of the established elite, and despite his Roman citizenship, a barbarian. Thrace is the northern part of Greece. It's kind of what would be modern day Bulgaria, really. His ways were rough, his focus entirely on the military. At the time of his accession, he was about 60 years old, and portraits of the man, as you can see, depict a strong-featured, frowning individual with a scary military haircut. The soldiers had killed Severus Alexander for negotiating with the Alemanni, one of the large German coalitions, and if you have ever studied French, you can hear the word for German in there, Allemand. This is, again, one of these other tribes that will play a part in early medieval history. Anyway, so the soldiers had killed Severus Alexander for negotiating with the Alemanni, one of these German coalitions. And so Maximinus had to be seen to reverse that policy. He therefore prosecuted vigorous campaigns all along the Danube frontier, picking up titles like Germanicus Maximus, Dacicus Maximus, and Sarmaticus Maximus. These are all, the greatest defeater of the Germans, the greatest defeaters of the Dacians and the Sarmatians. Our information is insufficient to judge whether these titles were really well earned or purely vainglorious, probably the latter. Shortly after his accession, though, 2 attempts were made to oust him. One of them came from the army, the other from the Senate, and both failed. But they had the added effect of making Maximinus extremely paranoid and suspicious. Maximinus never visited Rome. He made no attempt to reach out to any constituencies outside the army. To pay for his campaigns, and yet a further increase in army pay, Caracalla had raised the pay sometime earlier, Maximinus imposed heavy taxes, and as a result, his regime plummeted in popularity. And we also read this in Eusebius. When Severus Alexander, the emperor of the Romans, who ruled from 222 to 235, had brought his principate to an end after 13 years, he was succeeded by Maximinus Caesar, Maximinus Thrax, who ruled from 235 to 238. He, through ill will toward the house of Alexander, since it consisted for the most part of believers, look at that, a remarkable statement, raised a persecution, ordering the leaders of the church alone to be put to death as being responsible for the teaching of the gospel. So we have evidence that, well, at least we have this testimony of Eusebius that there were Christians within, all the way up inside the royal family at this time. And furthermore, that Maximinus instituted persecutions against the clergy of the church. Now, what do we make of that statement? The one about the persecution of the clergy, that would seem totally to be of a piece with all the other persecutions going on throughout Roman history that we've been talking about up until this point. But what about that idea that the household of the Severans was made up of believers, a lot of believers? Well, we do have another piece of information about this, and it's rather enigmatic. What it basically points to is religious syncretism of the Severans, at least of Alexander Severus. And this is what it says. Before I tell of Severus Alexander and his wars and his campaigns and victories, I will relate a few details of his private everyday life. His manner of living was as follows. First of all, if it were permissible, that is to say, if he had not lain with his wife, in the morning hours, he would worship in the sanctuary of his lares. This is a pagan shrine. Every family would have had one. It was to the ancestral gods of the family, in which he kept statues of the deified emperors, of whom, however, only the best had been selected, and also of certain holy souls, among them Apollonius, who the one we learned about yesterday, remember, the kind of magician, philosopher, Pythagorean. And according to contemporary writers, to a contemporary writer, Christ, Abraham, Orpheus, and others of this same character, and besides the portraits of his ancestors. Portraits would be in statues, or the funeral masks. If this act of worship were not possible, he would ride out or fish or walk or hunt according to the character of the place in which he was. This is told to us in that Augustan history I keep talking about. So this would seem to be more really of an illustration of religious syncretism than actual Christianity. Because Christianity is exclusive, you cannot worship other gods and Christ like this. Of course, as we saw, though, in paganism, this would have been totally, paganism was extremely syncretistic. It was always looking to worship all the gods, get everybody you can on your side. So be that as it may, whatever the situation was religiously within the imperial household, nevertheless, we do have evidence for the persecution of Christianity under Maximinus Thrax from this period. And returning to him, Maximinus Thrax declared his son Caesar as if to establish a new dynasty. However, Maximinus's support base was rapidly collapsing. So when the landed gentry in Africa balked at his new tax demands, they picked an octogenarian proconsul of the province who was named Gordian to be their new emperor. Gordian quickly became the rallying point for all those discontented with the Thracian, and he was handily confirmed as emperor by his fellow senators. Faced now with a full-scale revolt against his authority, Maximinus was butchered along with his son by his own troops at the city of Aquileia, which is the ancient antecedent of modern-day Venice, all the way up there in the north east of Italy. His memory was damned, the famous damnatio memoriae, and Maximinus Thrax had only ruled a little over 3 years. This brief reign is significant for 4 reasons, however. First, Maximinus was a man whose only qualification for power was that he was a professional soldier. He was therefore the first of the soldier emperors, or barracks emperors as they were called, who would dominate the 3rd century. Secondly, his authority rested on military support alone, and it was never secure. He was challenged 3 times in as many years. And third of all, his reign was dominated by dealing with Rome's frontier security to the point where he didn't even have time to visit the city of Rome itself. We're going to see that's a theme throughout all of late antiquity, that the city of Rome kind of fades away in terms of importance. Frontier zones, frontier cities, places like in Italy, Milan, or Trier in Germany, or Constantinople, Nicaea, Antioch. All of these cities become much more important in the late Roman and early medieval period. And fourth and finally, Maximinus's own soldiers turned on him as soon as his authority lapsed. These 4 observations constitute the essential pattern for the next 20 legitimate emperors and the 36 or so remaining claimants down to the year 284. As I say, Maximinus's successor, the old man Gordian, immediately appointed his son emperor, or co-emperor really, and the two ruled together as Gordian I and, as you see here, Gordian II. But the younger Gordian was killed in battle against a neighboring governor who was a Maximinus loyalist, and the elder Gordian committed suicide in response. Their joint rule lasted exactly 20 days, the shortest reign of legitimate emperors for the entire period covered in the 3rd century crisis. Welcome to the 3rd century. We now will skip over, though, 11 years to the year 249. In the interim, 4 men had sat on the throne and had fended off 6 usurpers. Between 244 and 249, the emperor had been a fellow named Philip the Arab, who you see in front of you, another professional soldier who had been praetorian prefect until his elevation early in 244. He had ruled for almost 6 years, so quite long given the period. Portrait busts of this man show a desperately worried man with an even more brutal haircut than Maximinus, and a stubbly beard to match. But despite, actually, and we read this about Eusebius, a very enigmatic statement. When after 6 years, Gordian, and he's referring to Gordian III here now, brought his government of the Romans to an end, Philip ruled along with his son Philip, and who succeeded him to the principate. I'm sorry, that is Philip the Arab succeeded Gordian III to the principate. It is recorded that he, being a Christian, wished on the day of the last Paschal vigil to share along with the multitude the prayers at the church, but it was not permitted to enter by him who was then presiding, that would be the bishop, until he confessed and numbered himself among those who were reckoned to be in sin. This was an ancient practice for people who were in who had committed very heavy sins. They were to once they had made their confession and received absolution, there still would be a period of penance afterwards, and they were to stand either outside the church or in the narthex, kind of in the kind of back part of the church. And that is what the bishop told him, according to the story. And who were occupying the place of penance, penitence, that's what that means. For that otherwise, had he not done so, he never would have been received by the presiding clergy on account of the many charges made concerning him. And it is said that he obeyed readily, displaying by his actions how genuine and pious was his disposition toward the fear of God. Now, there is no other evidence that Philip was a Christian. I think most modern scholars would not accept this statement by Eusebius. We could probably, they might go so far as to say that Philip may have been favorable to Christianity. He might have had Christians in his imperial retinue, but that is a very different matter than he being a Christian himself. The first Christian emperor almost universally being recognized as Constantine in the following century. But again, be that as it may, again, there's so many, our source material on this period is so patchy and sometimes contradictory that sometimes it's difficult to know exactly what to believe about it. But despite the efforts of Philip to project an image of stability by deifying his father, who had never even been an emperor, and also by elevating his son to be his co-emperor, as you read here in Eusebius, Philip still faced 6 usurpers and died in battle against one of them, or else he was murdered by his own soldiers. The sources disagree there too. And that happened in the autumn of 249. His 11-year-old son was immediately killed also. Well, the man who overthrew Philip was named Gaius Messius Quintus Decius Valerianus, or simply as he's known in English as Emperor Trajan Decius. He was about 40 years old, a senator, an ex-consul, and a former prefect of the city of Rome. He was actually appointed by Philip to command the armies in Pannonia, which is modern-day Hungary, along the Danube. But those armies proclaimed him emperor instead, and it seems, against his wishes, marched on Rome and ousted Philip. Now, you're probably asking yourselves, why on earth are all these emperors being proclaimed by unwillingly sometimes by their own soldiers? And the answer to that is the soldiers wanted their general to be emperor because he could get them free stuff. If your general, if you could make your general emperor, then he would obviously feel, gratitude for you. He would feel at the very least indebted to you in some way, and therefore, or perhaps even further, he would be afraid of you, so that his own life would be in jeopardy if he didn't deliver on some kind of goods for you. So this is basically, I think, one of the motivating factors. We see this time and time again throughout the 3rd century crisis. On becoming emperor, Decius added the name Trajan to his titles to associate himself with a strong emperor who had ruled in better days, but it didn't work. Within 18 months, Trajan Decius himself was dead. His reign was brief. However, it was highly significant for one main reason, and that is entirely something that interests us in our course right now. Because as times got harder, the pagan cults came under pressure. And according to pagan logic, bad times on earth could only mean that the gods were displeased. Emperors had long associated themselves with gods, even specific deities, but in these difficult days, that association became a matter of political necessity, as embattled emperors like Trajan Decius sought to find legitimacy in divine places. And so Decius sought likewise to strengthen the ancient cults and thereby to offer a rallying point around which to unify the empire. One inscription of him hails him as Restitutor Sacrorum, which means restorer of the sacred rites. Christians naturally ran afoul of this policy. They denied the ancient gods. In some quarters, in fact, Christians were denounced as the source of the gods' displeasure. And so they were held to be responsible for all of Rome's problems. And so one of the big changes that now takes place in terms of the persecution of Christianity this is one of your final exam questions is what are the kind of major turning points kind of in the development of the legalization of Christianity or in something like that. This would be one of the major turning points in the history of Christianity within the Roman Empire, because up until this point, persecutions, as I say, had been brief, local, and sporadic. But now, for the first time, Decius responded to Christian obduracy by giving out an edict that said everyone in the empire was to sacrifice to the gods in the presence of officials and to obtain a vaccine passport. Because I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. To obtain a certificate but for having done so. This edict, this law went into effect on January 1st, 250 AD. The order went out at the beginning of the year. Officials went out to investigate and to interrogate. Governors were given wide powers to hold tribunals and to determine who was a Christian and who was not, of course, according to the sacrifice test, and then to deal with those who refused to sacrifice according to the Roman principle of coercitio, or basically forcing them to do whatever they wanted them to do, and executing anyone who refused. Some Christians, we know, complied out of fear. Others, though, like Pope Fabian in Rome, refused and paid the ultimate penalty. Trials and executions ensued all across the empire. In particular, those who refused to sacrifice were often sent into the arena, the name for which is the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation, or condemnation to the beasts, condemned to the beasts. Fascinatingly, the text of Trajan Decius' edict of December 249, although it itself has not survived, what we do have is some indication of its contents from other sources. The edict seems to have commanded all Roman citizens to sacrifice to the gods for the safety of the emperor and of the empire. And because, remember, of the decree of Caracalla, now everybody living within the empire who was freeborn is now a citizen. It appears that the edict expressly exempted the Jews from obligation to sacrifice, which would have been, of course, in accord with longstanding precedents, but it definitely did not mention Christians at all. And so some historians believe that the edict was in fact aimed against Christians, which is, despite the fact that it explicitly doesn't mention them explicitly, but nevertheless, of course, they were the target of it. Remember, there never was, nor had been up until this point, and even after this point, an edict outlawing Christianity per se at this time. That never happened until the time of Diocletian. So the edict is reflected, though, in some of the more interesting archaeological discoveries from this period. A number of certificates of sacrifice issued to various individuals have survived. So the following right now that we'll read was discovered in Fayoum, Egypt in 1893. Because of the nature of the Egyptian climate, it was, it's so dry and hot that papyrus can actually survive for thousands of years there if it's buried in the sand. And so that's where this has come from. It's actually an original document. And this is what the certificate would say. The word here is a libellus. That's the Latin word for a certificate. To the commissioners of sacrifices in the village of Alexander's Island, from Aurelius Diogenes, son of Cetabus, of the village of Alexander's Island, aged 72, scar on right eyebrow. Isn't that a fascinating detail? In a time before photo ID, they actually would describe physical characteristics, to show who the person was. I have always sacrificed to the gods, the document says, and now in your presence, in accordance with the terms of the edict, I have done sacrifice and poured libations and tasted the sacrifices. These would be the meats, the steaks, basically, that were offered from the sacrificial animals. And I request you to certify to this effect. Farewell. Presented by me, Aurelius Diogenes, I certify that I witnessed his sacrifice, Aurelius Cyrus, in different handwriting. So somebody sat down there and actually signed this document. So the official or the scribe of the official would have written it up, and then this person signed his name. Dated the first year of the Emperor Caesar, Gaius, Messapus, Quintus, Traianus, Decius, Pilus, Felix, Augustus, the second of Epiphanes, that is June 26, 250 AD. These certificates were issued across the empire in enormous numbers, and approximately 42 of them have been found in Egypt, all apparently prepared by the same handwriting. So it was clearly, it was like going to the DMV or something like that. You had officials sitting there writing these things out. Now, it was no doubt a daunting effort to carry out this action. And because of the administrative nightmare that would have resulted from any attempt to issue certificates to literally all the inhabitants of the Roman Empire, remember, we're talking about 60 million people here, these certificates were probably only issued in instances in which particular individuals were suspected of being Christians and therefore disloyal to the emperor. In other words, it is likely that, yet again, the persecutions depended on local initiative. That is, on the actions of the decurions, the local elites, the leading members of a city, who had some sense as to who were Christians and who were not, simply by virtue of who was not showing up to those public sacrifices. Now, we also have firsthand accounts of what it was like during this terrible time of persecution, where people were literally being killed for not sacrificing to the gods. One of these comes from the letter of a bishop in Alexandria to Fabius, the bishop of Antioch. So Dionysius is the bishop of Alexandria, and Eusebius quotes this letter at some length. Let's read it together. It was not with the imperial edict that the persecution began amongst us, but it proceeded by a whole year, and this state of things continued at its height for a long time. But strife and civil war came upon wretched men and turned on themselves the fury of which we had been the object. And for a brief space we breathed again, since they had no time to indulge their anger against us. So, in other words, there had been previous persecutions going back before this, but because of the 3rd century crisis and civil war, it eased up. And the fury that was being vented against the Christians was turned against other pagans in civil war. But after the edict, straightway the news passed abroad of the change from that rule that had been more kindly to us. And great was the fear of threatened punishment that hung over us. And what is more, the edict arrived. And it was almost like that which was predicted by our Lord, well nigh the most terrible of all, so as, if possible, to cause to stumble even the elect. Howsoever that be, all cowered with fear. And of many of the more eminent persons, some came forward immediately through fear, others in public positions were compelled to do so by their business, and others were dragged by those around them. Called by name, they approached the impure and unholy sacrifices, some pale and trembling as if they were not for sacrifices, but rather to be themselves the sacrifices and victims to the idols, so that the large crowd that stood around heaped mockery upon them. And it was evident that they were by nature cowards in everything, cowards both to die and to sacrifice. But others ran eagerly towards the altars, affirming by their forwardness that they had not been Christians even formerly, concerning from whom the Lord very truly predicted that they shall hardly be saved. Of the rest, some followed one or other of these, others fled, some were captured, and of these some went as far as bonds and imprisonment, and certain, when they had been shut up for many days, then forswore themselves, even before coming into court, while others, who remained firm for a certain time under tortures, subsequently gave in. So a very terrible and very horrible business. And you can really see the full gamut of people's characters here. Some people, immediately betray Christ. Some people immediately run up and say, yes, we'll comply with whatever your orders are. And others at first do not and are tortured and then finally give in. And still others refuse to give in whatsoever and are executed. In some ways, we can see, we have seen, for those of us that have been paying attention to this sort of thing over the past year, we can see something of course, it's not anything as horrible as what went on in ancient Rome, but we can see something like it when the government decided to ban church worship in New York State, close down the churches. There were many who, even before those edicts came out from our mayor, our governor, immediately said, oh yes, absolutely, we'll close all the churches, no problem. Some only did so after they were told to do so by these illegal mandates. And then there were still yet others who said no, and they kept their churches open all the time. No doubt, human nature has not really changed at all in all of these thousands of years. Well, anyway, in addition to the things that we've just read, we are also told by Eusebius that on various occasions, especially in cities in Asia Minor, individuals within the Jewish communities actually helped point out who the Christians were. There are cases when Jews helped pagans in finding out who was a Christian and who was a Jew, and bringing it to the attention of the local officials, who then brought it to the attention of the governor. But again, all this really meant was that much of this empire-wide persecution really depended on local initiative, local factors. Even though the emperor had kind of issued an edict from the federal level, we might say, it came down to these local communities and people within them, individuals. And that, of course, is very typical of the way the Romans always ruled. Imperial rule very much depended on co-opting the local ruling elites and their cooperation. Even with the empire-wide persecutions of Trajan Decius, the scope and extent of this persecution is still difficult to document. Okay, we don't know exactly, of course, the numbers of those caught up in it, or the full extent of how it was actually how it actually happened. But the close identification of patriotism and pagan ritual, that is clearly the assumption here, we will see was only to strengthen in the coming decades. Decius himself never saw that development. He was killed in battle against a Gothic horde in Dacia, modern-day Romania, in June of 251. And altogether, the persecutions lasted then about 18 months. They came to a very abrupt end when Trajan Decius was killed by the Goths, and his successor, a man named Trebonius Gallus, essentially issued an act of clemency, clementia temporum, clemency of the age. Clementia was a very common virtue stressed on Roman imperial coins and Roman documents. And the main impetus for ceasing the persecutions was probably just a marked shift in priorities. Effectively, the imperial government halted the persecutions as abruptly as it began, not really so much because of any desire to be nice to the Christians, probably, but just simply because they had so many other problems that were going on. You had still the invasions, you still had the civil wars. The Christians, of course, saw this as an act of God. They had been delivered from the imperial government. And I'll just note in passing that while Decius was away on campaign, the mob at Rome elevated a senator as their emperor, who lasted only a few days. The powerlessness of the plebs could hardly have been made any clearer. Without armies at your back, you had no chance of being emperor of Rome whatsoever. 2 years later, then, after the death of Decius, and after a brief stint of some other emperors, 2 years later in 253, Valerian came to power. Okay, Valerianus. This man was a senator, and he was in his 60s. He had been sent to tackle a usurper in 253, but really, like Decius, Valerian's army had proclaimed him emperor instead. Then 3 armies therefore converged in North Italy. Those opposing Valerian, those on his side, and then there was others supporting their own emperor. Those who were opposing Valerian realized that they were outgunned, and so they turned on their leaders. And then the 2 legitimate emperors of the time and a further claimant were all killed by their own troops. Valerian continued on to Rome, accepted power, and instantly installed his adult son Gallienus as emperor. When Valerian took the eastern half of the empire for himself and left Gallienus in charge of Rome in the west, he heralded things to come in late antiquity, when the empire would be formally divided between east and west. But this tells us that already by 253, it was clear that the problems of the empire had become too vast for a single man. Now, Valerian, though, also instituted persecutions. And it was under the persecutions of Valerian that Saint Cyprian of Carthage died. Now, I want to read you some of the letters of Saint Cyprian of Carthage. He was Bishop of Carthage in the middle of the 3rd century. And they also are firsthand historical accounts of what was going on there. Let's read this. Valerian had sent a rescript to the Senate to the effect that bishops and presbyters and deacons should immediately be punished, but that senators and men of importance and Roman knights, this would be like the kind of second rung aristocrats of Rome, should lose their dignity, they lose their rank in society, and moreover be deprived of their property if they were Christians. And if, when their means were taken away, they should persist in being Christians, then they should also lose their heads. But that matrons should be deprived of their property and sent into banishment. Moreover, people of Caesar's household, whoever of them had either confessed before, that is, professed Christianity, or should now confess, should have their property confiscated and should be sent in chains by assignment to Caesar's estates. In other words, become slaves. The Emperor Valerian also added to this address a copy of the letters which he sent to the presidents of the provinces concerning us, which letters we are daily hoping will come, waiting according to the strength of our faith for the endurance of suffering, and expecting from the help and mercy of the Lord the crown of eternal life. But know that Xistus was martyred in the cemetery on the 8th day of the Ides of August, and with him 4 deacons. Moreover, the prefects of the city are daily urging on this persecution, so that if any are presented to them, they are martyred, and their property claimed by the treasury. I beg that these things may be known by your means to the rest of our colleagues, that everywhere, by their exhortation, the brotherhood may be strengthened and prepared for the spiritual conflict, that every one of us may think less of death than of immortality, and dedicated to the Lord with full faith and entire courage, may rejoice rather than fear in this confession, wherein they know that the soldiers of God and Christ are not slain but crowned. I bid you, dearest brother, ever heartily farewell in the Lord. Now, we're Saint Cyprian ultimately would be martyred during this round of persecutions, but let's pick up from another source right now. That same Dionysius, Bishop of Alexandria, also wrote a letter to one Hermamen, which is quoted by Eusebius, and he says the following things. And to John, he's referring to the book of Revelation, and to John also it is likewise revealed, and there was given to him, he says, a mouth speaking great things and blasphemy, and there was given to him authority and 42 months. One may wonder at both of these things under Valerian, and of them note especially the nature of his previous conduct, how mild and friendly he was to the men of God. For not a single one of the emperors before him was so kindly and favorable disposed to us, not even those who were said to have been openly Christians, as he manifestly was, when he received them at the beginning of the most intimate and friendly manner. At the beginning, typo, in the most intimate and friendly manner. Indeed, all his house had been filled with godly persons and was a church of God. Now, this is what he says right now is what he claims to be the origin of why Valerian decided to start persecuting Christianity. Remember, it had been stopped after after the time of Decius. So why did he begin again? This is what Dionysius claims. But the master and ruler of the synagogue of the Egyptian magicians, don't be thrown off by the word synagogue here. It actually doesn't refer to Jews at all. It refers to, this would be a temple of the Egyptian magicians, kind of like a kind of grouping together of Egyptian magicians. Macrianus, one of Valerian's ablest generals, persuaded him to get rid of them, meaning the Christians, bidding him slay and pursue the pure and holy men, as being rivals and hinderers of his abominable and disgusting incantations. For indeed they are and were capable by their presence and sight, and by merely breathing on them and uttering words, of scattering the designs of the baneful demons. So in other words, Christians who were present at these horrible pagan rituals could simply by being there and praying, make the rituals of no effect. And he advised him to perform unhallowed rites and abominable juggleries and ill-omened sacrifices, such as cutting the throats of wretched boys and sacrificing children of hapless parents and opening up entrails of newborn babies and cutting up and mincing the handiwork of God, as if all this would bring them to find favor. To the degree that, we don't know to what degree this was actually the case, but this is what a contemporary says. Well, in the East, the situation was very dire. The Persians had an able, energetic young king, Shapur I, who repeatedly raided into Roman territory and even sacked the vast city of Antioch, one of the four major cities of the empire in the East and the de facto capital, basically, of the eastern provinces. Valerian's movements and actions in the East are rather unclear to us due to the awful sources, but it is known that his eastern campaigns ended in total catastrophe because in 258 or perhaps 250, Valerian was captured alive by Shapur I of Persia. We read in Lactantius, a church writer of the 4th century, about this period. He says, "Presently Valerian, in a mood alike frantic, lifted up his impious hands to assault God, and although his time was short, shed much righteous blood. But God punished him in a new and extraordinary manner, that it might be a lesson to future ages that the adversaries of heaven always receive the just recompense of their iniquities. He, having been made prisoner by the Persians, lost not only that power which he had exercised without moderation, but also the liberty of which he had deprived others, and he wasted the remainder of his days in the vilest condition of slavery. For Shapur, the king of the Persians, who had made him his prisoner, whenever he chose to get to his carriage or to mount on horseback, commanded the Roman to stoop and present his back. Then setting his foot on the shoulders of Valerian, he said with a smile of reproach, 'This is true, and not what the Romans delineate on board or plaster.'" So he spent the rest of his days as a kind of human footstep. And this, what you see, the picture you see behind you, I'll just remove the words for a moment, is actually an engraving in Iran. You can actually go and visit it. It's at a place called Nakhsha-e-Rostam. I'm probably butchering that, but it's in the Fars province. He basically, it depicts that's Valerian right there, groveling in front of Shapur I on horseback. So what Lactantius says here is true. Well, the other emperor, Gallienus, had moved to Cologne on the Rhine River and split his time between there and the Danubian provinces. All the tribes at that time, in all the Germanic tribes up in Northern Europe now, were on the move. So the task of defending that frontier zone, that vast frontier zone, in its entirety was proving to be all but impossible. You have hordes of pillaging barbarians breaking into the empire at various points. Now you've got an emperor in chains. Invariably, imperial claimants began to sprout like mushrooms from dung. So many, in fact, emerged that later Roman tradition remembered them collectively as the 30 Pretenders. But upon hearing of his father's capture in the East, Gallienus took a novel approach. He did nothing. He claimed rather the entire empire for himself, and he left his father to his fate. That is, he left Valerian, emperor of Rome, to live out the rest of his days serving as a human footstool at the Persian court. Lactantius goes on. Valerian lived for a considerable time under the well-merited insults of his conqueror, so that the Roman name remained long the scoff and derision of the barbarians. And this also was added to the severity of his punishment, that although he had an emperor for his son, he found no one to revenge his captivity and most abject and servile state. Neither indeed was he ever demanded back. Afterward, when he had finished this shameful life under so great dishonor, he was flayed. In other words, he had his skin cut off, and his skin, stripped from the flesh, was dyed with vermilion red dye, and placed in the temple of the gods of the barbarians, that the remembrance of a triumph so signal might be perpetuated, and that this spectacle might always be exhibited to our ambassadors as an admonition to the Romans, that beholding the spoils of their captive emperor in a Persian temple, they might not place too great confidence in their own strength. So he was basically pickled and put on display and shown to ambassadors. Okay, this is and Lactantius, I'll just say, he was tutor to the emperor's Constantine's son, so he was in the imperial household. He would have known these kind of things. Let's read some of the commentary, the scholarly commentary on by Novak on Valerian's persecutions. Valerian's persecution was the earliest known attempt by the Roman government to attack Christianity as an institution, rather than merely as a collection of individuals. The Roman officials closed the churches and persecuted the clergy as leaders of the faith, rather than merely as Christians. Moreover, as Saint Cyprian's letter indicates, the persecution also seems to have been the first official instance of refusing to pardon in full those Christians who recanted. Thus, Valerian's persecution reflected a growing perception that Christianity was becoming a potentially serious political and social threat to the Roman government and the emperor's authority. The edicts of Valerian were widely evaded by Christians through bribery and the cooperation of local officials, many of whom refused to enforce the edicts. Saint Cyprian himself was able to hide from the authorities during the first wave of persecution. However, Cyprian who was familiar with the yearly circuit that the Roman governor traveled through in the province of Africa, was merely waiting until the governor came to Carthage before surrendering, in order that his martyrdom might occur before his own congregation. So if you didn't understand that, what it meant is that Cyprian went into hiding during the first wave of the persecutions, not out of fear, not because he wanted to not be martyred, but rather because he wanted to make sure that his martyrdom would be done before the congregation of his own people, that they would be able to see their bishop die for Christ, and that he would give them an example that they could follow and to not be afraid of death. And let's read his because he wrote letters during that whole time, and then we will read the acts of his martyrdom too. So this is a letter by Cyprian himself. Cyprian to the presbyters and deacons and all the people greeting. When it had been told to us, dearest brethren, that the jailers had been sent to bring me to Utica, this is a city in northern Africa, and I had been persuaded by the counsel of those dearest to me to withdraw for a time from my gardens, as a just reason was afforded, I consented. For the reason that it is fit for a bishop in that city in which he presides over the church of the Lord, there to confess the Lord, and that the whole people should be glorified by the confession of their prelate in their presence. For whatever, in that moment of confession, the confessor bishop speaks, he speaks in the mouth of all, and by inspiration of God. But the honor of our church, glorious as it is, will be mutilated if I, a bishop placed over another church, receiving my sentence of my confession at Utica, should go thence as a martyr to the Lord. See, he doesn't want to be martyred in Utica. When indeed, both for my own sake and for yours, I pray with continual supplications and with all my desires entreat that I may confess among you, and there, that is at Carthage, and there suffer, and thence depart to the Lord even as I ought. Therefore here in a hidden retreat I await the arrival of the proconsul returning to Carthage, that I may hear from him what the emperors have commanded upon the subject of Christian laymen and bishops, and may say what the Lord will wish to be said at that hour. But do you, dearest brethren, according to the discipline which you have ever received from me out of the Lord's commands, and according to what you have so very often learned from my discourse, keep peace and tranquility, nor let any of you stir up any tumult for the brethren, for voluntarily offer himself to the Gentiles. Don't go out and pursue martyrdom. Don't just go there and say, go to the local police station and say, hey guys, I'm a Christian. For when apprehended and delivered up, he ought to speak, inasmuch as the Lord abiding in us speaks in that hour, who willed that we should rather confess than profess. You see, confess means to speak when you need to speak. Profess means to speak ahead of time. But for the rest, what is fitting that we should observe before the proconsul passes sentence on me for the confession of the name of God, we will, with the instruction of the Lord, arrange in common. May our Lord make you, dearest brethren, to remain safe in his church and condescend to keep you, so be it through his mercy. So this was the letter that he wrote to the clergy before his martyrdom. What we're about to read right now are called the Acts of the Martyrdom of Cyprian. The Acta Martyria are a type of literature. There are ancient accounts written sometimes by eyewitnesses, sometimes by slightly later writers, of the acts of the martyrs, what event, the things that happened, how their martyrdoms actually transpired. And this is the Acts of Cyprian. Let's read it together. On the morning of the 14th of September, a huge crowd gathered at the Villa Sexti, as the proconsul Galerius Maximus had ordered. The proconsul commanded that Bishop Cyprian be brought to trial before him as he sat in judgment in the court called Sauciolum. When the bishop appeared, the proconsul asked him, "Are you Thascius Cyprian?" The bishop replied, "I am." "And have you acted as a leader in a community of impious men?" "I have." "The sacred emperors have ordered you to sacrifice." "I will not sacrifice." "Consider your position. Do what is required of you. I have no need to deliberate. The issues are clear." Galerius consulted briefly with his advisors and reluctantly pronounced sentence in the following words: "You have lived in an irreligious manner for a long time now, and have gathered about you a large congregation of criminals and unbelievers. You have shown yourself hostile to the gods of Rome and the rites by which they are worshipping. The pious and sacred emperors Valerian and his son Gallienus, and the right noble Caesar Valerian, have been unable to recall you to the practice of the official religion. Therefore, you are the instigator of abominations, a veritable standard bearer for criminals, and as such, you have been brought before me. Your death will be an example to those whom you have gathered into your criminal conspiracy. Your blood will uphold the law." He then pronounced the following sentence from his wax tablet: "It is our decision that Thascius Cyprian be put to death by the sword." This, of course, meant that he was a Roman citizen. As we've talked about many times, all would have been after the Constitutio Antoniniana. Bishop Cyprian simply said, "Thanks be to God." When sentence had been passed, the assembled brethren cried out, "Let us be beheaded with him," and followed him in a huge and tumultuous crowd. Cyprian was brought to the plain of Sextus. There he removed his cloak, and kneeling down, he humbled himself in prayer to God. He disrobed and gave his dalmatic, that is his kind of vestment, to the deacons. Clad only in his linen tunic, he awaited his executioner. When the executioner arrived, Cyprian told his followers to give him 25 gold pieces. His brethren spread before him linen cloths and towels. The blessed Cyprian blindfolded his eyes with his own hands. The presbyter Julian and the subdeacon Julian tied the ends of the handkerchief, since he was unable to do so himself. So died blessed Cyprian. His body was exposed nearby to satisfy the curiosity of the pagans. During the night, the body was removed by the light of wax candles and torches, and with prayer and great pomp it was brought for burial to a piece of open ground belonging to the procurator Macrobius Candidianus, near the reservoirs of the Mount Paulian Way. A few days later, the proconsul Galerius Maximus died. And there are other accounts. There are other accounts of the martyrs from this period. Saint Fructuosus, Bishop of Tarragon in Spain, he also, you can see from his dates, he was martyred in the year 259 by being burned alive. Let us read briefly this account. It was on the Lord's Day, January 16th, of course that means Sunday, January 16th, in the year that Aurelianus and Bassus were consuls, 259, that Bishop Fructuosus and his deacons Augurius and Eulogius were arrested. Bishop Fructuosus had retired to his chamber when a group of orderlies made their way to his house. They were Aurelius, Festucius, Aelius Polentius, Donatus, and Maximus. When the bishop heard their step, he immediately got up and went out to meet them in his slippers. "Come along," the soldier said to him. "The governor summons you with your deacons." Fructuosus said to them, "Let us go, or if you will follow me, I shall put my sandals on." The soldier said to him, "Put your sandals on as you like." As soon as they arrived, they were put in prison. Fructuosus, however, was calm and glad that he would receive the Lord's crown to which he had been called. He prayed constantly, and there were Christians with him, comforting him and begging him to remember them, that is, to pray for them. The next day in prison, he baptized our brother Rogatianus. After spending 6 days in jail, they were brought out for a hearing on Friday, 21st of January. The governor Aemilianus said, "Bring in the bishop Fructuosus, Augurius, and Eulogius." The court official said, "They are present." The governor Aemilianus said to Fructuosus, "Were you aware of the emperor's orders?" Fructuosus said, "I do not know their orders. I am a Christian." The governor Aemilianus said, "They have ordered you to worship the gods." Fructuosus said, "I worship the one God who has made heaven and earth and all that is in them." The governor Aemilianus said, "Do you know that the gods exist?" "No, I do not," said Fructuosus. Aemilianus said, "You will know later." Fructuosus looked up to the Lord and began to pray within himself. Then Aemilianus said, "These are obeyed, these are feared, and these are adored. If the gods are not worshipped, then the images of the emperors are not adored." The governor Aemilianus said to Augurius, "Do not listen to the words of Fructuosus." Augurius said, "I worship God Almighty." The governor Aemilianus said to Eulogius, one of the deacons, "Do you not also worship Fructuosus?" "No," said Eulogius, "I do not worship Fructuosus, but I worship the one whom he worships." Aemilianus the governor said to Fructuosus, "You are a bishop?" "Yes, I am," said Fructuosus. "You were," said Aemilianus, and he sentenced them to be burnt alive. As Bishop Fructuosus was being taken to the amphitheater with his deacons, the people began to sympathize with him, for he was much beloved of pagans and Christians alike. For he was all that the Holy Spirit, through Paul, the vessel of election, and the teacher of the Gentiles, declared that a bishop should be. For this reason, his brothers, who knew that he was going on to such great glory, were happy rather than sad. Holy martyrs of Christ, pray to God for us. Well, there are many, many accounts of these acts of the martyrs, and I want to draw your attention particularly to that last part, which says that many of the pagans sympathized with them, because this is precisely the statement that we began our whole class with. I quoted Tertullian for you: "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." That Christianity, the more it was persecuted, the more it grew. Okay, the Roman system of persecution backfired. For every Christian that was slain in public, pagans were moved to convert, because they saw the resolution, they saw the calmness in the face of people enduring such violent deaths. And that is still something that can be seen to this day. And we will talk more about that later on today. You know, Christianity is still the most persecuted religion around the world, and yet it is also the most populous religion around the world. There are Christians persecuted in China, in North Korea, all throughout the Middle East and in Africa. And yet Christianity still continues to grow. The 250s and 260s, therefore, saw the crisis of the empire reach its apogee. One emperor was in captivity, while Gallienus ruled over alone an empire that was breaking apart. As we'll see in a moment, secessionist states were emerging east and west. Gallienus himself, with hugely reduced forces, faced multiple challengers and multiple external threats simultaneously. Goths, Franks, Alemanni, and others were on the rampage. Yet astonishingly, despite these problems, Gallienus clung to power for 8 more years. And while the sources for his reign are poor, he did implement some useful ad hoc changes that were to long endure. Gallienus, for instance, initiated the development of rapid response forces stationed in Milan and North Africa. I'm sorry, what am I saying? In North Italy, characterized by a strong cavalry component. This was defense in depth, conceding basically border crossings to the barbarians, so allowing them to cross over, but then holding back reserves, and then using those reserves to strike at the invaders when they were already within the empire. So we're not talking about going on the offense the way that, say, Marcus Aurelius had done in the prior century, going out and spending lots of time fighting the barbarians, in the frontier on their own territory. Now the fight is really defensive. Gallienus also made various adjustments to the administration of the empire that presaged conditions in later antiquity, such as, for instance, the elevation of the equestrians to regular governorships or to army commands. Now, this entailed bypassing the Senate, which was the traditional source for such a post. And that fact gave rise to the hostile tradition about Gallienus perpetuated in the senatorial sources. Another harbinger of things to come was Gallienus's financial policy. You see, facing a need for more money, Gallienus just stamped more coins, necessarily debasing the silver and gold currency in the process and leading to inflation. We're going to talk more about this momentarily, but it's kind of like what's going on now, with all of these. I just got my money for, the child credits, $1,300 put into my account today by the government. It's very nice. Didn't ask for it, but it's very nice. And, all of these stimulus checks that we've been getting over the past year or so, it's all very nice, but what is the upshot of it is inflation, and nobody really understood the mechanism of inflation in the ancient world. So they debased the currency. That is, they mixed in more common metal into the silver to stretch it out, and that necessarily led to the currency not being as valuable, and that would produce problems. We're going to talk more about that, though, later. The emperor's struggle to stay in control came at a considerable cost to the empire's population, as the needs of the army rose fast to outstrip all other considerations. Gallienus also followed previous emperors and anticipated future developments by promoting his connection to various gods, principally the sun god Sol, which simply is the word for sun in Latin, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. But really, as he was in need of all the support he could get, he actually stopped the persecutions of the Christians, which had been going on, which had started, of course, which had taken a whole new turn under Trajan Decius, and then were, and then of course were revived under Valerian. In the early 260s, there was, though, a lull in the external invasions, and Gallienus celebrated his 10-year anniversary in a fairly peaceful empire. Now, surviving 10 years in power in the midst of the madness of the 3rd century was really, in and of itself, a significant achievement. Invictus, therefore, in unconquered, or invincible even, makes more frequent appearances in his imperial titles at this time, and also his coins declare him to be spes publica, the public hope, or else they herald the aeternitas augusta, imperial eternity. But such confidence was to prove to be seriously misplaced. Gallienus's optimism in claiming the whole empire for himself in 260 proved to be unfounded, because news of Valerian's capture and the ongoing depredations of barbarians and German barbarians and Persians caused some people to take matters into their own hands. And what we see now is a secessionist state appear in Gaul, led by a general on the ground named Marcus Cassianus Latinius Postumus. Postumus declared the empire of the Gallic provinces, the Imperium Galliarum in Latin, in the summer of 260. And he soon attracted Britain and Spain over to himself, to his banner. It is important to stress that this empire was not really a nativist movement seeking liberation from Rome. Really, what it was, rather, was a fully Roman state seeking security that the legitimate emperor in Rome clearly could not guarantee. Fitted out with its own senate, consuls, coinage, and emperor holding the tribunician power, this empire made its own capital in Cologne, the very city that Gallienus had used as his local capital in the 250s, and where, in fact, he had parked his son, Saturninus. When Postumus entered Cologne, of course, Saturninus was among the first to die. In all, there were to be 7 emperors of this breakaway empire of the Gallic provinces, but 5 of them lasted less than a year, which shows that the new state was not immune to the same sorts of problems, both political and military, that plagued the Central Empire under Gallienus. Remarkably, Postumus presided over his secessionist state for 9 whole years, though. His ultimate aims are somewhat unclear, but local security appears to have been his driving concern. The coins issued by the Gallic Empire celebrate Postumus as the Restitutor Galliarum, restorer of the Gallic provinces, or as the Salus Provinciarum, the safety of the provinces. The restricted scope of these claims suggests that Postumus harbored no designs on Gallienus' throne to keep it, even if Gallienus did harbor designs on his. In the end, however, Postumus met a fate all too typical of the era. The appearance of two challengers led to Postumus's murder at the hands of his own army when he refused to allow them to sack Moguntiacum, that is modern-day Mainz, the city in Germany, in the summer of 269. For the next 2 years, then, there was a power struggle within the Gallic Empire, but by early 271, a man named Tetricus was in charge. The central government's inability to guarantee the security, not just in the West, but also in the East, against the Persians, also led to a similar outcome there. Here in the East now, the eastern provinces over in this direction, a man named Odenathus, who you see in front of you, was an energetic and able leader of a quasi-Roman trading city named Palmyra in Syria, one of the real, up until about 6 or 7 years ago, a real gem of antiquity with the ruins and beautiful, beautiful Roman ruins. I always wanted to go there. Unfortunately, it was all destroyed by ISIS. They blew things up. They blew up all the beautiful architecture and stuff like that. So I probably will never get to go. But anyway, this was this kind of quasi-Roman sort of Near Eastern trading city, Palmyra, and it rose up in prominence by doing for the East what Postumus was doing for the West, securing the frontiers. In fact, this man Odenathus not only checked Shapur I in 260, he actually, in old-fashioned Roman style, led incursions into Persian territory. He took the offensive. Well, Gallienus took a novel approach in dealing with this breakaway state in the East and Odenathus. He tried to subsume Odenathus under his own authority. The Palmyrene state was, and the Palmyrene ruler Odenathus was given consular insignia, and he was declared the Dux Romanorum, the leader of the Romans, and also the Corrector Totius Orientis, the reformer of the entire East. But in 267, Odenathus was murdered. Many suspected the fell hand of Gallienus behind this deed, but the murder may just have been par for the course in these troubled times. Whatever the case of that may be, Odenathus was succeeded by his no less energetic wife, Zenobia, a really colorful woman in antiquity. She charted a more openly independent course for the Palmyrene state and began to seize control of Rome's eastern provinces. By 270, much of the Roman East was really the Palmyrene East, ruled over by a female potentate, styling herself Zenobia Augusta. A confrontation with the central authorities was inevitable, but Gallienus was not going to be the man to see it. Now, those are the four people I wanted to talk about. Before concluding the dismal narrative of these rulers, though, we might look briefly at a handful of the 38 unsuccessful claimants of the mid-3rd century as exemplars of that category of person. Two were, let's take the two Gordians in 238. They ruled not even 3 weeks, as I mentioned, but they are counted among the legitimate emperors of Rome for the mere fact that the Senate in Rome recognized them within that brief time. Had things gone slightly differently and they hadn't been recognized, we would include those two Gordians in the roster of failed imperial rivals. Aside from Postumus and Odenathus, though, Gallienus faced 14 such rivals. 3 of them, I think, can stand as paradigms for the group. Shortly after Gallienus became sole emperor in 260, the governor of a province that was called Illyricum, this would be basically what used to be called Yugoslavia on the Danube, was declared emperor by his men in what I think should now be a familiar pattern. This man was named Publius Regalianus, and he had been installed in Illyricum by Valerian, but he may have been motivated by how Gallienus abandoned his father and supposed co-emperor to Persian captivity. He may have been motivated by that, or perhaps he was just greedy. In any event, Regalianus scored a victory against invading tribesmen and then faced an avenging Gallienus. He was defeated and killed in battle. Again, following the capture of Valerian, which was clearly something of a traumatic event that prompted so many to reconsider their options and to raise the banner of revolt or try to declare themselves emperor. A man named Fulvius Macrianus, a general in the eastern army of Valerian, working in league with the praetorian prefect there named Ballista, wonderful name, he was hailed as emperor. Macrianus had extracted the remnant of the army from that disaster that had seen Valerian captured, and he was thus immensely popular with the troops. He marched toward Italy to press his claim, but was met in the Balkans by one of Gallienus's generals, who was named Marcus Aelius Aureolus, who had just put down yet another pesky claimant. Macrianus was defeated and did not survive the encounter. And this Aureolus, as it turns out, was to bring about Gallienus's end, for following his defeat of Macrianus, Aureolus was himself declared emperor by his men. This was in early 262, when the Gallic Empire was up and running, and also when Palmyra was going great guns in the east. That is, at a moment when the central emperor Gallienus looked very weak, which was true. He was weak, and at that time, and he could do nothing about Aureolus. In fact, he made an alliance with him, and together they attacked Postumus in Gaul. Since the sources are so poor, it is hard to discern what status it was that Aureolus, this guy, enjoyed during these years, but he seems to have survived his elevation as emperor in 262 and somehow patched up his relationship with the emperor Gallienus. It's really quite an extraordinary story, and we'd love to know more, but we just don't because of the poor sources. However, in 268, while Gallienus was off dealing with Goths, also in the Balkans, Aureolus was declared emperor again, and this time by the cavalry forces in Milan. Having dealt with the Goths, Gallienus then turned back to besiege him, but was himself murdered by plotters among his own staff. So I guess 14 usurpers, a divided empire, and now a guy claiming to be emperor for the second time was just too much, even for Gallienus's supporters. Gallienus died at the age of 55. He had ruled for 15 years, 7 of them with his father, Valerian, and 8 of them alone. Although much maligned in our pro-senatorial sources, Gallienus managed to survive for 15 years in an age when many reigns were measured in as many months or weeks. He also initiated a series of reforms, as I mentioned, and they were probably ad hoc and somewhat reactive, but they built on what came before and were to have lasting consequences. In conclusion of all this, if you couldn't follow all of that, it's totally fine. I hope that this has conveyed something of the mayhem and the chaos that prevailed during these years between the death of Severus Alexander and the death of Gallienus. Looking, therefore, at the Roman Empire in 268, there was every indication that it was now finished. Battered by waves of foreign invaders, divided within, and now stripped of a surprisingly long-lasting, if besieged, emperor, there was no reason to expect that the Roman Empire would endure much longer. Who, therefore, could have foreseen that within 20 years, the entire situation would be turned around by a series of energetic soldier emperors who extended the empire's life for another 2 centuries? How this came about occupies our attention in the next lecture. But for now, before we attempt a more in-depth analysis of the persecutions of Decius and Valerian, we need to explore 2 further aspects of the 3rd century crisis that we have not so far discussed. The first is the economic aspect. And I hinted at this before. Because to meet the threat of external invasion and the civil wars that were becoming commonplace in Roman life, Roman emperors increased the size of the Roman army drastically during the course of the 3rd century. Most likely, they doubled the size of the army. It may have reached an enrollment of almost 600,000 men at its height, and paying for an army of that size in the ancient world, paying for the bureaucracy necessary to administer that army, was an enormously expensive endeavor. Roman emperors, therefore, resorted to raising taxes as high as they dared on their subjects in order to pay for this much larger army. But even more significantly, they also resorted to the devaluation of the currency in order to get enough money to pay for their soldiers. Roman emperors progressively put less and less valuable metal in their coinage so that they could get coins out of the same lump of silver or gold. However, this practice of putting less and less silver or gold into your coinage and periodically recalling all the coins in circulation so that you could remelt them and create new coins more and stretch them out even further, led to inflation, drastic inflation within the empire. In fact, it has been argued that by the 260s, there was hardly any silver left at all inside of Roman coins. And it has been estimated that between the years 256 and 280, the cost of living in the Roman Empire increased by something like 1,000%. That meant that something, if you wanted to put it in modern day dollar terms, something that costs $1 at one end of that spectrum would at the other end of it cost $10. Okay, so that's, that is an enormous amount of inflation. As an illustration of this, a modius, that is the Roman bushel of wheat, cost half a denarius in the year 200 AD, but it cost 300 denarii in the year 300 AD. Okay. Likewise, with the land ravaged and depopulated by the endless wars, agricultural and mineral production severely decreased. Additionally, the population may very well have been declining overall in the Roman world, and it's possible that people may have been feeling on the exposed frontiers that they were not safe. They began to pull back into the cities. And this, of course, would create a situation where it made the exposed frontiers even more exposed. But it also produced a situation where people were flowing into the cities, where they had little hope of productive livelihoods, of gaining employment, of gaining jobs, or of gaining income. They became, therefore, increasingly a drain on the already stretched resources of the state, a state which itself was considerably straitened by its economic circumstances already. Once again, therefore, you can see how one problem generates additional problems, and additional problems generate additional problems. And the whole thing is sort of a spiraling out of control. The imperial response to this, as we have noted, was to debase the currency, to stretch it out, as it were. And the Roman economy suffered incredibly because of this. In fact, many scholars have even argued that it became virtually demonetized during this period, because the money, it is argued, was worthless. People were reduced to bartering goods rather than accepting money because the money was not valuable anymore. This is, I would say, the usual argument, that the money was rapidly debased, and furthermore, this debasement sparked an inflationary spiral that's often been compared to, say, the Great Depression of the 1920s or 30s, really the 30s. Now, that's the usual argument. It must be stated, though, that although this is the view that is commonly held in most textbooks today, and one which has a long history of scholarship going back to the 1920s and 30s, it has nevertheless been challenged, or at least been given nuance by some scholars in more recent years. First of all, these contrarian scholars would say the actual debasement lasted only a short time, approximately 25 years. The notion that the money was totally worthless, furthermore, is wrong. As also they would say is wrong the notion that the price surges had the same impact on the Roman economy as the spiral inflation of the late 1920s and 30s had. They would say that is very misleading. Because for one, during the periods of debasements, the coins still had some value. Okay, they may have been copper with a silver coating, but we do have numerous coin hoards from all over the Roman Empire. A coin hoard, are basically savings that people have secreted away for a better day, and then they never came back to them. So we've actually found many, many of these coin hoards, dug in a field somewhere in the middle of Gaul or whatever. Modern day scholars have found them. And for instance, there is a hoard from Britain from this period that has some 535 coins of the Emperor Gallienus and the Gallo-Roman separatists included in it. The coins in the hoard are all coins of the period of debasement, and someone buried them away and never recovered them. He may have been killed, enslaved, or something else happened to him. He may have forgotten where he put it. There was that civil war in 273, maybe that saw the reunification of Britain with the central Roman government. So maybe who knows why he didn't come back. And there is a coin of Gallienus from the Roman mint that shows him as Marti Pacifero, that is Mars, the bringer of peace, with all sorts of traditional symbols on it. And the point that I'm making is that clearly these coins still were money. They still had some value. Nobody would bury a whole hoard of over 500 coins if they didn't have any value. Kenneth Harl, a scholar of many aspects of antiquity, has published similar hoards from Turkey for the period of inflation and monetary crisis, and he argues very strongly against the traditional all-out interpretation of the numismatic data, largely because the very existence of all these hoards indicates that the money still was worth being set aside. A second point to make in this is that starting in 274 and then again in 293, and through the whole of the 4th century, soldier emperors didn't debase coins anymore. They reformed the coins and they created new types of coins. They created, in some cases, what I might call fiduciary coinage, very similar to the type of money that we use today, that is fiat money, money in which the state says it has the value that it has, and you can exchange it against gold, and you can pay your taxes in it, and you could, it's accepted as legal tender for all debts and transactions. So the notion that this money was totally worthless is really incorrect. The extent of the crisis, the extent of the fiscal chaos by these lights has been overdrawn. And by the 270s and 280s, certainly prices had stabilized. The borders had been restabilized, and the emperors, starting with Diocletian, as we will see in 2 lectures' time, had imposed reforms that brought about peace and order back to the Roman world. He did try to regulate prices, which didn't really work out too well, but that's another matter. But he did bring peace and order back to the Roman world, and it would come at a high price in terms of freedom, and definitely he would be perhaps the worst persecutor of Christianity that the Roman Empire ever saw. But nonetheless, from the pagan perspective, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was restored by the end of the 3rd century. Okay, so we have military crisis of the 3rd century. We have a political crisis, as we've talked about, and we've talked about now the economic crisis. There is, though, in the 4th place, what some scholars have characterized as a cultural, moral, or even spiritual crisis. And this is by far the most subtle and indeed the most controversial of all aspects of the 3rd century crisis. The Irish scholar E.R. Dodds famously wrote, in the most famous articulation of this aspect of the 3rd century crisis, a monograph called Pagan and Christian in an Age of Anxiety. Fordham, of course, has it in the library, and you would do well to read it. The entire culture, pagan and Christian, he says, was moving to a phase in which religion was to be coextensive with life, and the quest for God was to cast its shadow over all other human activities, end quote. That is a quote from this book. Now, what he meant, I'll read it one more time. The entire culture, pagan as well as Christian, was moving to a phase in which religion was to be coextensive with life, and the quest for God was to cast its shadow over all other human activities, end quote. What he meant by saying this is that he saw people of this period opting out of civic life and opting for religion. In many ways, opting out of the kind of civic allegiances that had animated Roman life for a long time before this. Scholars who agree with this position have noted an ascetic impulse, a tendency for people to opt out of this world. We will see in some of our future lectures talk about the Christian version of this opting out, of this ascetic impulse, namely monasticism, which begins really in the 4th century. But it is important to say that even among pagan cults, there was a tendency for people to opt out, to feel that this world no longer had anything of value or interest for them. They felt less loyal to it, and they elected not to participate. For example, we can see that the predominant philosophical current which evolves during this period, which we moderns call Neoplatonism, and which we're going to learn about in our next lecture, tended to disdain the whole created world. It tended to suggest that matter was in and of itself evil, that all of the created universe was somehow evil, and that the best thing one could do was to escape this world, get out of this world, and have nothing to do with this world. And as I say, this was the dominant philosophical current in the that evolved in the 3rd century, and it involved large numbers of people. It is most famously expressed by the founder of Neoplatonism, Plotinus, who said that philosophy ultimately is about the flight of the alone to the alone. Likewise, temple petitions, many of which survive from Egypt, and prayers put up inside of temples in Egypt are particularly revealing. People would go to a temple in antiquity, and these pagan temples still exist, and they would make a small offering to the god or the goddess whose temple it was. They would post in a public space in the temple a kind of little scrap of paper, a small prayer, or some imprecation, a request for something. And literally hundreds, if not thousands of these temple petitions survive and can be read to this day. And they're very poignant. The reason why I put these up, these come from Japan, but they do the exact same thing over there. So I give you an idea of what it looks like. And some of these are very poignant. They say, "What is to become of me? Will I be sold? Shall I have wages?" This is the nature of their imprecations put up in temples. Again and again, we see a sense of despair in this time, a sense of pessimism, and a sense that things are indeed in pretty bad shape. I might add, too, that this is one of those places, and there aren't many, where we can hear the voices of more or less ordinary people coming through the sources. Not the great and the powerful, but of ordinary people. And we would notice something else, too, if we could travel back in time to the 3rd century world. We would see a dramatic decline in public building at this time. From Britain to Mesopotamia, to travel in that Roman world, even today, is to see Rome, mostly in ruins, to be sure. In a few cases, Roman buildings are still standing in pretty good shape, but Rome's impressive ruins dot the landscape. There's aqueducts, there's temples, there's amphitheaters, there's roads even. Rome's great building projects have been called rhetoric in stone. And I'll have a lot more to say about some of these kinds of building projects in later lectures, but suffice it to say for the moment that when Rome conquered areas, they came in and they put up a basic kit of Roman urban amenities. Yes, on the one hand, to provide basic services for people like bathhouses and aqueducts and fountains and roads and the town square. But on the other hand, they also did this to say, look, we can do this. You can't do this. We did this. This is why it's called rhetoric in stone. It is an expression of their power, of Roman civilization. But given that idea, there is almost nothing built in the 3rd century. The elites weren't building so much during this time. The Roman state wasn't building. It was kind of a blank spot in the architectural history of the ancient world. Certainly, economic shortages, to be sure, are one explanation for this. Constant political turmoil is another explanation for this, right? If you're only in office for a few weeks, you can't exactly enact a vast building project. But there is this third explanation, and that is the idea that the Romans were particularly good at winning over local elites to the Roman cause. The Romans didn't coerce these people. They didn't force these people with a gun. They made people want to buy into the Roman system. And as a result, one of the things that urban elites in the late antique world, indeed the classical world in general, really wanted to do was to be visible, to show off their benefactions to the city by building stuff and putting their name on it somehow, okay? What we see, though, in the great cities like Athens, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and so on, whereas something like 90% of the population still lived in the countryside, nevertheless, these great benefactors, they put their names all over the big public monuments that are found inside of these cities of the ancient world. In fact, in those great cities, there was actually even a word for this process of rich people building stuff for the benefit of the community. It comes from the Greek word for benefactor, and it means, which is euergetes, and the word in English is euergetism. It basically means like do-gooderism. You might call it philanthropy. But the Romans won over local elites. the decurions to spend enormous amounts of their own money to glorify these cities in the Roman fashion. Eurgotism also paid for urban services, for fire brigades, for police brigades, for street repair, for bridges, for water supply, and so on. Eurgotism declines to a trickle in the course of the 3rd century, during this, especially this terrible 60-year period, basically. And it is another mark of the difficulties of this period. Now, okay, having said that, because this is what academics do, there are scholars who have sought to bring nuance again to the picture that I've just elucidated and to interpret the data differently. Because they would say, these contrarians, that there is other evidence from coins, from inscriptions, from relief sculpture that indicate, they would argue, that the picture we have of the 3rd century is not as dismal as we think it is. In part, it's dismal because we don't have many literary sources, true, they would say, but we do have these other sources from archaeology, from the coins and from the inscriptions. These sources have indicated that in the cities of Italy, Africa, and Asia Minor, the ruling classes, the decurions, as I keep calling them, and as they were known, these families who had sufficient wealth to run their cities, many of them survived the crisis of the 3rd century. Many of them would indeed continue to carry on civic government afterwards. And what is more important, these elites rallied to the emperors of the late 3rd century. After things begin to kind of get back on track, they rally to the emperors. And that rallying can be documented in a number of ways. One is by the issuing of all sorts of types of coins. Relief sculpture also that was put up in public places, which celebrated games and festivals to the traditional gods. And those gods were honored in the presence of the emperor. Many of the coins in reliefs depict the emperor going to the east, arriving in that particular city as they're going off to fight the Persians, let's say. But again, it's after the period of this dismal kind of 50, 60-year period in the middle of the 3rd century. The emperors towards the end of the 3rd century would be hailed as companions to the native gods. The Latin word here is comes, companion. We have many coins in which the local god is shaking hands with the emperor, or the emperor is being received by the decurions, calling out and presenting the cult statue. We have large numbers of coins and inscriptions, especially inscriptions from the great sanctuaries such as Didyma, the Asclepion of Pergamon that we learned about yesterday, where the emperors who were fighting the wars of the 3rd century went and invoked the help of these gods. And when they were there, they extended privileges to the locals, gave them dynastic games, especially games that were on the level of the Olympic Games or the Pythian Games or the Pan-Hellenic Games of Greece. So in many ways, the coins, the inscriptions, the relief work, the archaeology shows a remarkable continuity in imperial patronage to the cults of the cities and to the sanctuaries of the Roman world. And at the same time, it shows a loyalty expressed by the ruling elites to the of the numerous cities of the Roman world to the emperor. While invasion and civil war definitely did bring about change, there's no doubt about that there was change. It's not the kind of full-out spiritual crisis that the age of anxiety interpretation of E.R. Dodds would have us believe, they would say. In fact, these other scholars have argued that the religious history of the 3rd century is better understood not as a failure of nerve on the part of the ruling classes of the Roman world, but a reaffirmation of traditional values, a move back to traditional religion, an invoking of the gods of Rome as their defenders against invasion and civil war. And they would point to the fact that we have no evidence of large numbers of Romans simply giving up their traditional faith for mystery cults at this time, as we've talked about so many times before. In fact, we have no evidence for any new cult at all in the Roman Empire, really ever since that snake cult Glycon back in 160 that was instituted by the charlatan Alexander of Abonotegas. Quite to the contrary, what we have is an unbroken record through most of the 3rd century, not in the literary sources, true, but in the visual evidence, the coins and the medallions, and even in the archaeology that demonstrates the rebuilding of sanctuaries, the refurbishing of sanctuaries that pagan worship continued. Perhaps, definitely, I would say, on a diminished level, funding definitely isn't as lavish as it had been, but nonetheless, there is a trickle of it. So in some ways, these two interpretations can be sort of meshed with one another, but they would say it is an extremely important point to stress, and one which calls into question this whole period, especially from 260, when the great persecution of Valerian ceased, to 303, when the persecutions of Diocletian began, this period of some 45 years that Christian authors often refer to as the peace of the church, they would say that really calls into question the rapid Christianization that is oftentimes argued for during that latter half of the 3rd century. There definitely is an increase in the number of Christians, that their numbers definitely are greatly increasing. But do we see it so much as, can we also interpret that to be a rapid flight from traditional religion as a result of the 3rd century crisis? Not so much. The evidence from the imperial sources, from the local coins, and the archaeology shows that those converts were primarily from the lower and middle classes, and to a much more limited extent from the elites. Okay, there would be some definitely all the way up to the imperial household, but they would be more limited in number. So what did come out of the 3rd century from the pagan perspective, especially for the elite political classes, was not, if you look at it from the end of the 3rd century, was not social upheaval, not alienation, but a reaffirmation of the traditional religious values. That's certainly going to be the case under Diocletian. There was this important change, and we will talk about this in subsequent lectures, from the late 3rd century onwards. The iconography and all the visual arts placed the emperor in the company of the gods. Emperors were expected to speak to the gods. They had ceremonies that were virtually divine. They proclaimed battle miracles. Marcus Aurelius fighting the Germans on the Danube, and as we'll learn about in our next class, Aurelian proclaiming that the sun god Sol Invictus intervened and threw back the Palmyrene cavalry. Emperors would become expected to be comes, companions of the gods. Therefore, imperial loyalty, imperial integrity all become much more closely bound up with loyalty to the emperor and the gods. The 3rd century essentially expanded the powers of the Roman emperor as Pontifex Maximus, as chief priest of the Roman Empire. Loyalty itself came to be centered on the Roman emperor, not necessarily on the city of Rome or on all the abstract traditions of the Republic, and that would result in the creation of a new tone of government, which we call the dominate. See, the period of the emperor up until Diocletian would be known as the Principate, but then after Diocletian, it becomes known as the dominate, the rule of a master, a much more openly autocratic form of government, an emperor who would be surrounded by officials, eunuchs even at the court, which were men of high rank who had been fixed so they couldn't compete with the emperor. That is, they couldn't assassinate and take over because the emperor's position was possibly in question as a military man who had risen to power, and so he was trying to gain legitimacy. But all of that we will leave for subsequent lectures. Now, that is actually a good point, I think, at which to take a little break. Now let us turn to an analysis of the persecutions ordered by the Emperor Trajan Decius in 250 to 251, and then by the Emperor Valerian in 258 to 260. These two persecutions differed from the previous ones that we have discussed in that they were empire-wide. The imperial government issued edicts for the first time that required citizens of the entire Roman world to appear before altars to offer sacrifice not only to the gods, but also to the genius of the Roman emperor. That is, his spirit, the potential spirit of the emperor that would be sanctified to join the gods. These persecutions represent, therefore, a decisive turning point. Potentially, the imperial government could have always done this, but as I have noted in the past, the persecutions were always local, they were sporadic, and they didn't last a very long time. And they very much depended upon the attitude of the Roman governor and even more so on the local officials in the cities, the so-called decurions, who were so important in rooting out Christians and dragging them in front of the altars so that they could make sacrifice to the gods. The reason for these empire-wide persecutions can easily be linked to what I discussed so far in our lecture today: the civil wars, the invasions, and the need to win back the favor of the traditional gods. This is an issue that has often raised questions among scholars, some arguing that the persecutions really were an indication that paganism was on the demise, on the decline. Christians were on the rise, clearly. They had become very noticeable. And on the other hand, the Roman emperor and the pagan elites felt that they had to root out the Christians. On the other hand, there are other scholars who would argue that the persecutions were best understood, or are best understood as a traditional revival, and that the main reason that Christians were being forced to appear before the altars was not because the number of pagans was on the decline, but because they denied the gods their due, and that jeopardized the whole Roman peace. And this is a point I've stressed time and time again in dealing with the traditional cults. For instance, the goddess Artemis of Ephesus, or Artemis Ephesia, her great cult statue that was well known throughout the ancient world. If you did not offer sacrifice to the gods and goddesses, they would become angry, and they would then visit communal punishment. Everyone would suffer. Jupiter or Artemis Ephesia, Zeus, whatever divinity you were talking about here, could send a plague. They could send thunderbolts upon the entire community. Certainly defeat in battle was a big one. That was, a big sign to any Roman mind. If we're losing again and again in battle, well, that something must have gone wrong. And by pagan logic, it only took a few people to opt out of the traditional sacrifices to bring down the wrath of the gods. So there really are two ways of looking at what's behind these persecutions. It's remarkable that the Roman imperial government felt the need to do this, and that suggests a very powerful religious motive behind the emperors to detect Christians. Some have suggested that they used taxed registers to find out who was a Christian, who was a pagan, but we're not sure of that because imperial officials didn't designate people by their religious affiliation until the 4th century, that is, until the time that the Christian emperors ruled, when it was important to designate Christians and from pagans, because Christians had certain civil advantages over pagan taxpayers. On the other hand, it's more likely that the persecutions, again, depended on local initiative. That is, decurions, the local elites, the leading members of a city who had some sense of who the Christians were, who were not showing up at the sacrifices. And in addition, as we've talked about before, Eusebius does mention that on various occasions, especially in cities in Asia Minor, Jews helped point out who the Christians were. And there are cases where the opposite actually also happened too, where Jews actually helped helped Christians, and perhaps helped hide them. But there were definitely cases where Jews helped pagans in finding out who was Christian and who was, and bringing them to the attention of the local officials, who then brought it to the attention of the governor, and then the trials would begin. Now, that meant that so much of this empire-wide persecution really did depend on local initiative, even though the emperor had passed the edict. And this is why and this totally is in harmony with what we know about a great deal of the administration of the Roman world. Imperial rule very much depended on co-opting those local elites and having them cooperate. Even with the empire-wide persecutions of Trajan Decius, the scope and extent of this persecution is still difficult to document. For the Christians, however, this was a terrifying time. For the first time, the imperial government interfered directly in the lives of its citizens on a matter that didn't involve taxes or, military, enlisting in the military or something like that. And for the first time, the imperial government wanted all of its citizens to indicate by an act of sacrifice to the gods and to the spirit of the Roman emperor that they were loyal citizens and that they were behind the ancestral gods who were thought to be the protectors of Rome and who were essential in the battle against barbarian invaders, usurpers, and rebellious legions. Now, from the other perspective, we must ask ourselves, what was the effect of the persecutions on the Christians? Well, the important point to make here is that among Christian authors, and Eusebius repeats this a lot, that long-known phrase that came out of the apologist Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That is, for every Christian cut down in the arena or thrown to the beasts, more pagans were moved to inquire about Christianity, to investigate, why are these people dying for their faith? What is this faith? Pagans weren't going into the arena and dying for their faith. So what's this? And this position, which was argued by the apologists in the early 2nd century and picked up by Eusebius, writing much later in the time of Constantine, after the triumph of Christianity, the conversion of Constantine, this has been a powerful argument by which scholars have investigated, a powerful lens through which scholars have investigated and judged religious change in the 3rd century, that the martyrdoms and persecutions gave Christians a much wider publicity than they would have achieved on their own. They were prohibited, from the simple fact of it being persecuted, from missionary activities. They were basically underground for the most part. It was only in the early 3rd century that Origen was able to open up a school, a Christian academy he actually wasn't the one who opened it up, but he was one of the most famous headmaster of that school in Alexandria, and therefore could develop a full Christian theology and wrote in a language that pagans, pagan philosophers and elites could readily appreciate. And then it's in the mid-3rd century, in the later 3rd century, that we see these empire-wide persecutions. So these persecutions, it could be argued, gave a lot of publicity, more potential exposure to the faith than the Christians had otherwise. This position was argued brilliantly by W.H.C. Friend in his book Martyrdom and Persecution of the Early Church. I mentioned this work at the start of the course. It's often the basis from which many scholars approach the whole issue of religious change to this day. This issue is fundamental to understanding the whole conflict and debate between pagans and Christians. What did the persecutions mean to the Christians themselves? And then we'll have to ask the other question, what did the persecutions mean to the pagans? And those are two very different issues. Already Christians were becoming known to coming to the attention of the imperial government in various ways. There's a famous legal case towards the end of the 3rd century involving a bishop in Antioch named Paul of Samosata, who had apparently basically treated the church as his private property and tried to alienate the congregation from it and kind of either sell or dispose of it somehow. And the congregation objected, and none other than the Emperor Aurelian, who at the time was in the east in Syria, so as to fight the Palmyrenian breakaway state, none other than him he actually adjudicated the case and sided with the congregation, awarding the church back to the congregation and going against the Bishop Paul. That was an important legal precedent, and it was later even used by the Emperor Constantine to legislate on behalf of bishops and to basically get involved in ecclesiastical matters. And the creation of ecclesiastical courts and the codification of the powers of bishops in Roman cities and so on. It was a very remarkable case, but it shows that Roman emperors could, when called upon, deal with their Christian subjects as legal Roman citizens with rights that could be adjudicated by the emperor. It also gives some sense of the difference between the social reality and the legal reality of Christians. Persecutions, even empire-wide persecutions, were violent and sporadic, just like the earlier ones. But when they were not being persecuted, they could be treated with respect as Roman citizens. The second important point to make about these persecutions vis-a-vis the Christians is that to the Christians, these persecutions were seen as great tests, as testing of their faith. In Eusebius's mind, the Decian persecution and the persecution of Valerian, and of course, the later one that we'll be discussing, the final great persecution of Diocletian and the Tetrarchs from 303 to 313. There is one period of persecution after that too, but that is kind of the greatest of them all. All three of these empire-wide persecutions were seen as sort of like a final test that led up to the conversion of Constantine, this miracle of God, that Christians went from being a persecuted minority to being ultimately the official religion of the Roman Empire. Well, Eusebius sees this as a great test, and that God ultimately vindicated his people in the end. Christians, of course, had reason to believe this, and we'll be discussing the conversion of Constantine and what that meant to both Christians and pagans alike. But before the conversion of Constantine, these persecutions were the most virulent, most widespread, and most persistent of all those that Christians had faced. On the whole, Christians had stood up quite well. The bishops had refused to sacrifice for the most part. I mentioned Pope Fabian at Rome. He was beheaded in late January of 250. Of course, he is considered a saint and martyr because of that. And we read some of the acts of the other martyrs from this time, St. Cyprian, St. Fructuosus. Christians remembered these martyrs, and they were their heroes. These martyrs who went into the arena, and the whole practice of naming one's children after the saints, those martyrs who had refused to sacrifice and who therefore had died in the arena or elsewhere, usually horribly destroyed by animals or killed as essentially helpless victims to the delight of the mob. This all begins now, this act of honoring the saints by naming one's children after them. It resulted in two important aspects of Christianity in the 3rd century. One, the development of a whole set of, as I said, names associated with the saints. So the Christians gradually evolved their own nomenclature, and you get the development also of the veneration of the saints, which of course is biblical and goes back, to the very beginning of Christianity, but it really takes on it becomes really fully developed in this time. And then also the veneration of the relics of the saints, where the remains of the saints would be collected from the time of their martyrdom. And the tradition becomes that altars, Christian altars, would always be erected with some of the relics of the saints built into them. And churches would be dedicated to these holy martyrs for the faith. One of the greatest beneficiaries of these developments were, of course, the bishops. The bishops, as I mentioned earlier, were there from the very beginning. They are mentioned in Scripture as being the kind of pastors of the church, the successors to the apostles. They are also very important in defining the canon of the church, that is the canon of the New Testament scriptures, and increasingly making Christianity an administratively organized body, where they are the preeminent hierarchs. But bishops who refused to sacrifice, who held up against the persecutions, increased not only their own fame and authority inside of the church, but also the whole, what we might call the episcopal institution. The office of bishop came to be looked at with tremendous awe and reverence because of the heroic stand that these saints like Saint Cyprian and Fructuosus and others that we've read made in the face of persecution. It's in the 3rd century that bishops in Italy and North Africa and cities throughout Asia Minor and Syria begin to acquire the kind of reputation that we would associate with, say, bishops of the Middle Ages. This was already, of course, true from the very beginning of Christianity, but it becomes even more pronounced during this time. And to give you some example of what I mean by that, I would like to just read a short excerpt to you from Eusebius talking about the martyrdom of the bishop Polycarp, which I mentioned yesterday, but only very briefly. He was martyred in the city of Smyrna, today Izmir in western Turkey on the shores of the Aegean. He was martyred in a local persecution, where, again, same kind of thing, a mob of people denounced him and other Christians to the local authorities, who then arrested him and brought him into an arena. Eusebius goes into great detail how the officials of the city of Smyrna ordered a great pyre to be built to burn Polycarp alive. They wanted to nail him to it, but they wanted just tying him to the wood, and then Polycarp offers up a prayer, and then the fire is lit to burn Polycarp alive. And this is what Eusebius reports. And he is apparently reporting an eyewitness account of Christians who actually saw the martyrdom. He says the following thing: when he, that is Polycarp, offered up the Amen and completed his prayer, the men in charge lit the fire and a great flame shot up. Then we saw a marvelous sight. We who are privileged to see it and were spared to tell others what happened, the fire took the shape of a vaulted room, like a ship sail, filled with wind, and it made a wall around the martyr's body, which was in the middle, not like burning flesh, but like gold and silver refined in the furnace. Indeed, we were conscious of the wonderful fragrance, like a breath of frankincense or some other costly spice. At last, seeing that the body could not be consumed by the fire, the lawless people, by which he means the pagans, summoned a executioner, a confector, to come forward and drive home his sword. When he did so, there came out a stream of blood that quenched the fire, so the whole crowd was astonished at the difference between the unbelievers and the elect. To the elected belonged this man, Polycarp, the most wonderful, apostolic, and prophetic teacher of our time, the bishop of the Catholic Church in Smyrna. For every word that he uttered was and shall be fulfilled. That's a powerful description, based on an eyewitness account of what those martyrdoms of bishops meant. The Christians in the great empire-wide persecutions often appeared apocalyptic, as we saw in the reference to the book of Revelation in the letter of St. Dionysius of Alexandria. To many other Christians who did sacrifice, who broke down, who lapsed, sometimes seeing those few brave Christians ready to march off to the arena, they became voluntary martyrs in time. That is, they later would declare themselves, we are Christians too, we will join our brethren and our sisters in the arena. And that was a powerful way of the Christians defining themselves as the new race, the third race, as the new Israel. And the martyrdoms and persecutions were absolutely essential in Christian self-definition. The martyrs emerge as new heroes. On the other hand, many of the church fathers were often a little concerned about that last aspect of what I just said, that the kind of voluntary martyrdom. You weren't supposed to offer yourself up for martyrdom like a suicide victim. You would try to escape detection, you should try, and if you couldn't, and they caught you and they brought you in front of the tribunal, well, then you had no choice but to declare your Christianity and to suffer martyrdom. But you shouldn't go out and pursue it, because that's pride. You see, that's kind of presumption. There's even a council, the Council of Elvira in Spain in the year 300, and Canon 60 of this council says that the bishops agreed that if a person went to a pagan festival where there was a cult statue and spit on it or destroyed it in some other way, and then they killed that person, that is not martyrdom. That is presumption. That is pride. Martyrdom was very carefully defined, therefore, by the Christian church fathers as an act of bravery and courage when there was no other option. Okay, so this is a really important point, because suicide obviously is totally unchristian and totally against the tenets of Christianity. Self-murder, in fact, it is from ancient times always assumed to be essentially one of the only unforgivable sins, because it takes away the possibility of repentance. All sins can be forgiven in this life upon repentance, but once this life is over, then no, repentance is no longer possible. And that's exactly what happens with suicide. Not every time, of course. Suicide is such a horrible thing, such a tragic thing. There are instances when the church will see to it that if a person is insane, or there's some other circumstance, they weren't in their right mind for some reason, maybe there's some economy that could be reached, in that, some kind of loosening of the rules, they could be buried in a Christian cemetery, be reconciled to the church, but usually not, though. Okay. In addition, there were many Christians who did lapse and did sacrifice to the gods, and that will bring about issues later on. Should these people be rebaptized? Had they renounced their faith? They had to be brought back into the church somehow. Was just confession enough for that? And what about clergymen who became, who had lapsed? There were some of those. Were the sacraments that a lapsed clergyman, were the sacraments that he performed still valid? This was a major division, actually, that would take place between kind of the more rigorous position and the people with a broader notion of what what the church is capable of, basically, and the ability of God to forgive and to absolve all sins. And it became a major issue at the opening of the 4th century when the Emperor Constantine converted. Just to kind of leap ahead for a moment, the North African church was very much split on this matter. There was, on the one side, the rigorous position, which are known as the Donatists, who basically said that no Christian who had lapsed could ever be reconciled to the church. No sacraments that a lapsed clergyman performed thereafter were valid. No baptisms were really baptisms. No Eucharist were really Eucharist. And then there was the position that the church ultimately codified as its position, which was that no, the sacraments of a clergyman, even the dirtiest and worst person imaginable, are still valid as long as that person is an ordained priest, a canonically ordained priest, so or bishop. And furthermore, every sin can be forgiven upon repentance, so confession, and then there would be a time of penance afterwards, but nevertheless that person could be reunited to the church ultimately. So that would all have to be worked out, though, later on. And so on the whole, the persecutions and the martyrdoms unquestionably were of great importance for the definition of the Christian community. On the other hand, let's return now to this question that is uncomfortable for some modern scholars. Did the martyrdoms and persecutions of the Christians lead to large numbers of pagans being impressed by this act of martyrdom to at least find out about Christianity and then convert? The simple answer is yes. One prominent historian estimated that in 260 AD, the year Gallienus became sole emperor and put an end to the persecutions of his father Valerian, about 1 million Christians lived in the empire. By the year 300 AD, however, so some 40 years later, there were roughly 6 million, or 10% of the empire's inhabitants, perhaps even slightly more than 10% if the total population were less than the usual figure of 60 million. Some of that growth even came from prominent families entering the church. By the end of the 3rd century, Christians could be found in the imperial court and among every profession, essentially, of the empire. Certainly by that time, the myths about incest and cannibalism among Christians had largely been debunked because everybody knew somebody who was a Christian, and they knew that that wasn't true. Of course, there were many who still hated Christians. The pagan intelligentsia, as we're going to see, were kind of a real holdout of this. They found Christians ignorant, ridiculous, appalling, as we saw yesterday. Certainly anybody with a financial interest in pagan worship, such as the priests or priestesses, the augurs, the diviners, the fortune tellers, the statue makers, they all loathed the Christians for destroying their businesses. Many in the army and government still suspected Christians of disloyalty to the empire. And this brings up another important point, and that is, what did these persecutions, what did these martyrdoms mean to the pagans? Well, Keith Hopkins, a great social historian, one of the great social historians of the past generation, unfortunately, one who died way too young, before he, while he was still very much at the height of his powers. He wrote a seminal article that is known as Murderous Games. It was one of the links that I put out last night for you to read. He put this out in a collection of essays, and it's an article that really elucidates the importance of gladiator games and animal combats in Roman society. And he elucidated the fact that these games were a vicarious psychological experience that reaffirmed that the Romans were masters of the world. Emperors used the gladiator games as a way of reinforcing the Roman social order, with Romans being seated in the arena based on their ranks. The senators and so on would have the best seats, then the others behind them, and so on, all the way on down the line in terms of social class. And the outcasts of society being, of course, on the floor of the arena itself, facing either the gladiators or the beasts. Many would say then that the persecutions represented for the Romans a reaffirmation of patriotism and imperial order. And yet, modern examples of martyrdom, such as those that pervade the communist and Islamic worlds in our day, argue against this rather limited interpretation, and instead argue for the position articulated by the early church, namely that the blood of the martyrs is indeed the seed of the church, and that the power of God is made perfect in weakness, And this is exhibited so clearly by Christian martyrs in their acts of defiance against the absolutism of the state. And it is their most eloquent sermon, their simple act of being peaceful in the face of their ultimate demise, their violent death. It's not an easy thing to die a violent death, not an easy thing to be sawn asunder or to be thrown to beasts. And this indeed was the greatest, most eloquent sermon that they could give, the most powerful missionary tool that could be proclaimed on earth. And to just give you some illustration of what that was like, I would like to show you now a short video that comes from Africa, from Libya, and it is of a group of Coptic Christians who were martyred by ISIS a few years ago. And I'm not going to actually show you the actual act of martyrdom where they were beheaded, but I just want you to pay attention to this quality that I'm trying to articulate, this peacefulness in the face of death. Every one of these men that you're about to see is about your age, okay? No doubt they have or had the same dreams that you have, to get married, to buy a house, to get an education, to have a livelihood, to see the world. And yet, when faced ultimately with the choice, either convert to Islam or to suffer martyrdom, they gave the ultimate sacrifice and peacefully went to their graves. Let us take a look right now.
Praise is due to Allah, the strong and mighty, and may blessings and peace be upon the one sent by the sword as a mercy for all the worlds. O people, recently you've seen us on the hills of Asham and on Dabiq's plain, chopping off the heads that have been carrying the cross delusion for a long time, filled with spite against Islam and Muslims. And today we're on the south of Rome, on the land of Islam, Libya, sending another message. O Crusaders, safety for you will be only wishes, especially when you're fighting us all together. Therefore, we will fight you all together until the war lays down its burdens and Jesus, peace be upon him, will descend, breaking the cross, killing the swine, and abolishing jizya. And the sea you've hidden Sheikh Osama bin Laden's body in, we swear to Allah, we will mix it with your blood.
course, a icon of them receiving the crowns of martyrdom, painted in the Coptic style, receiving the crowns of martyrdom from the angels and being welcomed into heaven by Christ. Okay, now I don't think I need to say much more about that, but the message, I think, can be carried over very clearly to what we've been talking about today. That when you see the look on these men's faces, softly praying, not crying, not blubbering, not screaming or begging for their lives, but that sort of peace and resolve, it is so far beyond anything else that any really that any words can say. That and the proof of this is that of this same principle, that it did have an impact on the pagan world, is ultimately in the fact that, as I said, Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world, and yet it is also the largest. And it can, and despite all that, and that has always been the case throughout history, that there have been, throughout the 20th century, the communist regimes of Russia and elsewhere in the world, and wherever Christianity seems to find itself, of course, there have been long periods of time where that wasn't the case everywhere, but nevertheless, it continues to grow, and in fact, one might even say it thrives in an atmosphere of persecution. If you contrast that with, say, how easy things are for us in the West, with our Netflix and our Grubhub and all the rest of it, we see a great kind of lukewarmness, or even a falling away from the faith. But in places like the Middle East, or like these communist countries in East Asia, where to be a Christian is really to, essentially not know if you're going to be living tomorrow, we see a great expansion of the church and much more fervor of faith. So it really, it's paradoxical, but in a sense, it is a perfect explication of the words of Christ, "My kingdom is not of this world." And that the kind of things that the world gives actually take away from Christian faith, whereas the more hostile the world is, the more Christian faith blossoms.